Welcome to the podcast, Let's Talk Polarization. I'm your host, Olivia Chang, a Bay Area student passionate about addressing America's political divide. LTP examines political polarization through a multitude of lenses: vaccination, economics, religion, and more, to educate youth, stimulate civil discourse, and increase cross-partisan unity. Our bi weekly episodes include interviews with experts and discussions between passionate individuals seeking common ground. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. James Adams, a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Davis, whose research explores parties' election strategies, along with the levels, causes, and consequences of cross-party hostility and distrust in Western publics. This is the second of two episodes with Dr. Adams. In the first, Dr. Adams explains why shifts in voter policy preferences, shifts in rival party policy, and past election results motivate party elites to shift their policy positions, and the use of valence-based versus policy-based campaigning. The second episode investigates the implications of vote-seeking parties on competition and party governance, and how they may interact with California's open primaries, and posits a cautionary tale for a polarizing America through historical precedent and the psychology of group allegiance. I hope you enjoy! Welcome back, Dr. Adams. I'd love to start by discussing your book, Party Competition and Responsible Party Government, a theory of spatial competition based upon insights from behavioral voting research. What are the implications of vote-seeking parties on competition and governance?
So the first thing I'll tell you is that political scientists have reached absolutely no consensus about whether you're more likely to win elections if you take a more radical position or a more moderate position. The more moderate position, you can probably see intuitively the appeal. If the American people on average are fairly moderate, in that you have some liberals and some conservatives, but some moderates, maybe what you need to do is to go for the center. The argument on the other side is that if, as a Democratic politician, you take a sharply liberal position or a Republican takes a sharply conservative position, the argument on that side is you energize your base and you get the voters who are on your side of the issue excited. And when they're excited, they're more likely to turn out to vote, and they're more likely to work on your campaign and to donate money to your campaign, and so on and so forth. So there's no real consensus about what works. I'll just tell you what both of the earlier books that I wrote, one of them in collaboration with Samuel Merrill and another professor named Bernard Groffman, contrary to the intuition that it's best to be centrist and to just go to the center of public opinion, in fact, political parties and candidates can often do surprisingly well by taking sharply non-centrist positions. Now, we don't necessarily say that those are the best positions, but while many people believe that, gee, if you're way out of the mainstream, that's going to cost you a huge number of votes. Our research suggests either, well, no, it'll cost you a few votes, but surprisingly few, or perhaps it may even gain you votes compared to taking a moderate position. This was on several countries, the United States, but also Britain and France and Norway, that we found was considerable virtues in energizing your base. Again, I'm talking about virtues here strictly in terms of gaining votes. Whether that is actually advocating the positions that are best for the country, that's a much thornier question. I'll mention one other thing that's particularly relevant to the United States. One of the explanations that's often offered about, gee, why are the Democrats and Republicans so polarized on policy positions? Why are there so many Democrats who take very liberal positions and so many Republicans who take so many conservative positions? Well, one argument for this are the primary elections that both parties use to select their candidates. In the primary election, it's going to be registered Democrats who are going to be the only ones who can vote, or in some states, independents can vote too, but it won't be Republicans. Now, I should note here that California has an unusual open primary system. So my discussion here doesn't apply to California now, but it applies to, say, presidential primaries, and it applies in most states outside of California. The argument is that a Democrat politician would say, well, if I'm going to even make it to the general election, I have to win the primary. And to win the primary, I have to announce liberal positions. Having won the primary by announcing liberal positions, the candidate can't then just turn around for the general election and say, well, I know I said I was liberal, but I'm actually a moderate, because then their opponent and the media will accuse them of flip-flopping and pandering and having no core principles. The point I'll make here, and this is a paper I have with Samuel Merrill that we published, almost 15 years ago, I guess it was now, is you might say in that case, well, then why do the parties select their candidates using primaries if it's going to result in candidates who are away from the center of public opinion and who will have trouble winning the general election? Well, note that elections are not decided on policy positions alone. Voters, when they're evaluating candidates, react to the candidates' positions, but they also react to the candidates' likability and charisma and ability to communicate effectively and to be articulate and so on. That is, they tend to react well to people who are effective campaigners and present themselves well. If you're a political party, and it could be very valuable for the general election for us to have a candidate who is an effective candidate, who is likable and charismatic, and who can attract voters in that way. And there are many examples in, well, all sorts of primaries of candidates who look very strong prior to the primary. And all the experts said, gee, look at this candidate. They have a lot of experience. They're well known. They've raised a lot of money. They have a lot of political endorsements. They're going to be very strong. And then the primary campaign started, and the candidate, whatever their merits, just turned out to be a really ineffective campaigner. And they lost the primary election to a more effective campaigner. Well, from the point of view of the party, they might say, boy, we dodged a bullet there. What if we hadn't had a primary and we'd selected the candidates using some other method? We might have chosen this candidate. The fact that the primary allows the party to figure out and often select a candidate who is a strong campaigner, that may compensate or even more than compensate for the fact that the candidate's positions are out of the mainstream. That was something that former governor and movie star Arnold Schwarzenegger was put in while he was governor of California. He argued, and the state legislature passed for this open primary system. And one of the big arguments that Governor Schwarzenegger made in favor of the open primary system, and many political commentators and politicians agreed with this, is this will result in the selection of more moderate candidates. Because you're not just having something where all the Democrats have to appeal to a bunch of liberal primary voters and all the Republican candidates need to appeal to a bunch of conservative Republican primary voters, but even at the primary stage, you need to appeal to the entire electorate. There can be some virtues in having more moderate candidates. They may be more in tune with the center of public opinion, and another nice side effect might well be that they will reduce the amount of anger and hostility across party lines, because now these policy debates won't be as sharp as they would otherwise be.
That's so funny. Who would have thought that Arnold Schwarzenegger was behind California's open primaries?
How ironic that the Terminator was the person who was in favor of the political system that was supposed to reduce the amount of fighting and political tension.
Exactly. And it goes back to this idea of political polarization. What is at risk if we continue on this path towards extremism?
Yeah, that, Olivia, is one of the main reasons why I'm studying this, because I'm very worried about what could come next. The study of what political polarization leads to is very much in its infancy. So we don't know very much yet about that. And I should stipulate, I have not done any research on this yet. I've been busy trying to measure levels of effective polarization across countries and trying to answer the question, where does it come from? But of course, the reason that we are interested in that is, as you might guess, because we're worried about what effective polarization might lead to. So let me list some of the things that commentators speculate that political polarization may cause. And I'll start with one of the only ones where there has actually been a lot of research done by academics. Partisans of both parties appear willing to discriminate against people who support other political parties in all sorts of contexts. A lot of this research has been in experiments where people are asked to make decisions involving money, usually fairly small amounts of money, but nevertheless, they're informed sometimes that they can give a certain amount of money to this other person. And in some cases, they're informed that the other person is from their own political party and sometimes from the opposite political party. And you see in these experiments that people are more willing to give money to people from their own political party. Uh, and in other experiments, that they would be more willing, if they were, say, on a committee to award a fellowship or a scholarship, that they would tend to, all else equal, prefer to award it to someone from their political party than to their opponents. But there's other research that suggests that it may be a more widespread phenomenon than that. There may be significant numbers of people who would say, well, I don't want to go to a restaurant if it's run by people, or a restaurant chain if they're associated with the other political party, that I prefer not to rent my house if I'm a Democrat to a Republican, or if I'm a Republican, I prefer not to have a Democrat as a roommate, and perhaps not to have someone from the other political party as a neighbor or a coworker or as a member of one's family. To give you one striking example of this, take the topic of racism and compare it with this anger across party lines. There were widespread surveys conducted back in the 1950s and 1960s asking people just flat out, and usually it was white people who were being asked this, how would you feel if an African American married into your family? And what you saw back in 1960 was that about half of all Americans said no. White Americans said, I would prefer not to have an African American marry into my family. Nowadays, when people are asked the question, how would you feel about someone from the opposite political party marrying into your family? About half of all people say, no, I don't want that. One way of putting that is to say that in some ways, and this is a phrase that not me, but another scholar used, is that partyism is the new racism. People not only will discriminate against outpartisans, they're not shy about telling people they are. It's almost like a badge of honor. Look at me, I won't have anything to do with the other party. So those are some of the things that can lead to a breakdown in social and economic relations, for example. But of course, there can be consequences for the whole country at the level of the political system. It could lead to political paralysis. If Democrats and Republicans, say in Congress, just refuse to work with each other on anything, then in cases of divided government, like we have right now, if members refuse to ever cross party lines in Congress and vote for legislation sponsored by the opposite party, we could have complete paralysis. Note that it can also lead to politicians, perhaps with the support of ordinary voters, being willing to violate democratic norms. One set of survey questions that is widely asked, and Noam Gidron and Will Hornan have asked this in a survey across 10 countries, is agree or disagree. It is acceptable for my party to bend the rules in order to keep the other party out of power. And another question is, it is acceptable to use political violence in order to prevent the other party from gaining power. A distressingly large number of people answer yes to the question about bending the rules, and more people than you would think state their support for using political violence, or at least that they would condone political violence on their side. That could lead to a situation where the United States or any other Western democracy is just not as democratic as it used to be. Note that both Democrats and Republicans are convinced not only that that might happen, but that it's already happened. The most striking example being the January 6th insurrection at the American Capitol, which was, of course, directly inspired by an angry group of Americans convinced that they were patriotically trying to undo the Democrats stealing the election, causing dozens or hundreds of injuries and, sadly, several deaths as well. And of course, there have been other examples of political violence. There was the Representative Gabby Giffords, who was shot by an angry partisan of the other political side. Representative Giffords, who's a Democrat, is now one of the most public advocates of gun control. And it's not a coincidence that she was shot. But you also had Representative Scalise, who was a Republican, who was shot, and this was during a congressional softball game. He was shot by an angry supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders. We've seen other examples as well, such as what has seemed to be a planned attempt to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. So we've already seen some instances of political violence. Let me note that it's not limited to the United States. In Britain, in the last 6 or 7 years, there have been two members of parliament who are roughly equivalent to our members, our Congress people, who have both shot and murdered by angry constituents. So you see this in other countries as well. But the danger is that what is now fairly sporadic political violence could lead to widespread political violence, or, God forbid, a second civil war. And the other possibility, which a process that could happen either violently or peacefully, is that the country could literally break up into more than one country. And I increasingly hear this attitude expressed by people. I hear many people in California sometimes talk about almost wistfully, gee, wouldn't it be great if California and Washington and Oregon, if we could just become our own country? We didn't have to deal with the people from some of these states where people have different political beliefs. And at the same time, I imagine there are plenty of people in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas who look at California and say, fine, please leave. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. As I say, what would make it likely to happen is if we think it can't possibly happen. And the analogy I always give is with the famous ship, the Titanic, this famous ship back in the early 1900s that was supposedly unsinkable, the great unsinkable Titanic. And the Titanic sunk. And if you ask, why did it sink? Well, the proximate cause was it hit an iceberg, water rushed in, and the ship sunk to the bottom of the ocean. But if you ask what was the wider cause, I would say it was because it was unsinkable, or because everyone thought it was unsinkable. Because the captain thought it was unsinkable, he was somewhat reckless in speeding the ship at relatively high speeds through an area where there were known to be icebergs. And there's some evidence the crew didn't pay as much attention and wasn't as vigilant as they might have been in looking for icebergs. I think the real danger to the United States comes if we're all complacent, and if we all say that couldn't possibly happen here. We're the United States of America. You know, in my lifetime, I've seen many things happen which everyone said couldn't possibly happen. The Soviet Union collapsed. 2 or 3 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, all the experts didn't see it coming. Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. All of us experts here, and I'll include me on this, if you'd asked us 6 months before the election, could Donald Trump possibly be elected, we would have laughed. And I did laugh. And I said, of course he couldn't possibly. Let me give you all the reasons Donald Trump couldn't possibly be elected president. So my own personal experience is things that are supposedly impossible are often possible. Things that seem highly unlikely are often likely. My sense about this country is we will probably be okay as long as we recognize the dangers and take steps to guard against them. If we sail along like the Titanic into these political waters filled with icebergs, that's when I think we're likely to hit an iceberg and the United States could sink.
These threats of a physically divided country and civil war are alarming. Are there any ways we, as individuals or communities, can reduce the threat of political polarization?
Well, I'd go back to something, Olivia, I said before, and this is something that at least everyone can do. You know, President Biden is in a much stronger position to take steps and to do things than I am or you are, obviously. But I would go back to considering the idea of being respectful towards our political opponents. It is easy to believe that our opponents are not just wrong, but they are bad people and perhaps even evil. Many people do appear to be willing to harshly condemn other people without knowing them and without making an effort to understand their point of view. We don't really look at people on the other side and we don't really listen to them. We simply assume, well, you're beyond the pale right now. It can be satisfying to believe that people on our side, that we're not just right, but we're virtuous. Look at us good people. We're heroically fighting against the bad people, the evil people on the other side. Aren't we wonderful? Yes, it can give us some gratification to believe this. I'm frankly skeptical that any of us, or that a lot of us, including me, that we're as pure as we like to think we are. We have blind spots about our own weaknesses and shortcomings. I personally have many weaknesses and shortcomings. And I know many people who are on the other side of the political divide who are absolutely lovely people, who are thoughtful and considerate and kind, and who would give you the shirt off their back. And some of those people, they've reached different conclusions than I have about what the best policies are for this country. Well, they have different life experiences. They know things that I don't know, and they reason in sometimes different ways than I do. I guess if I have a political philosophy, it would be this, and it would start by observing the following. One virtue of being older, and I'm 60 years old, is that I've lived long enough to form many, many political judgments. And one of the striking things I've seen over the course of my lifetime is just how often I've been wrong. How often policies that I was convinced, oh, we shouldn't do this, this is going to be terrible, have worked and made America stronger, and other policies that I was convinced were going to be wonderful have just blown up in everybody's face. Because of that, I simply don't feel that I have the qualifications to look at somebody who has different political beliefs than I am and be certain that they're wrong, number one, but even more so to write them off as a human being. I've come to the conclusion that the world is infinitely more complicated than my ability to understand it. Because of that, I don't always succeed, but I try to be humble about my own wisdom and to remember that I'm frequently unwise. All I can reasonably say to people on the other side is, I hope you can forgive me for all the times I've been wrong and all the mistakes I've made. But I have no right to ask you to forgive me unless I tell you now in advance that I'm willing to forgive you for any weaknesses and shortcomings that you have. I believe you're doing the best you can. I hope you'll believe that I'm also doing the best I can, even though far too often I get it wrong. And that's it. That's how I see things. And we'll have to see what happens next with our country and its politics.
Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Polarization. I hope it was fascinating to hear about what polarizes politicians, what is at stake if polarization continues, and how to view politics through a more humble lens. If you would like to participate in the podcast, we'd love to have you. Please contact me at letstalkunite@gmail.com. And find more at Let's Talk Unite on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and my website, letstalkunite.org. Have a great rest of your week.